What? What do you want? Hmm? What? What was that? Well, hello again, YouTube. It's me. Let me try that again. Well, hello again, YouTube. It's me, your best friend and secret lover, Evan Hillis. And I'm here today to proudly show you my video that I've been slaving away on for several months, on and off. I've started this video around October, I believe, and I've been kind of slowly chipping away at it, and the reason is because it's a sensitive topic and it involves the coronavirus pandemic and basically how I handled it and what I experienced while living in Guangzhou, China. I'm going to be talking about the good things that China did and also some of the bad things and maybe some of the ugly things, and then I'll finish up by talking about the aftermath. And also, yes, this video has been patched together from many clips taken over the months. So you're going to see different facial hair, different hairstyles, different clothes, different lighting. So please forgive the janky nature of the video. But I hope that you still can enjoy the content. So without further ado, let's jump into the video. The video topic for today is quite a bit more serious, obviously. I'm talking about COVID-19. COVID-19! The theme of 2020, the thing we all hate. And with it being in the middle of November now, in 2020, and cases are back on the rise in the US, a lot of people have been asking me, okay, how was COVID handled in China? Or how was your experience? What was it like there? And so I thought I would make a video kind of explaining a little bit more about that and going into detail about some of the good things, some of the bad things, and everything in between of my experience and how China was able to get it mostly under control in a relatively short amount of time, especially when you compare to the US and see how we still have tons of cases. All right, so let's just get into it, and I'll get started with talking about how the experience was from my point of view when I first heard of it. So, we know now that this was all getting started in Wuhan in the middle of December 2019, but it wasn't until about January 2020 that it became common knowledge, in China at least. That is exactly when my girlfriend and I just went on our trip to the Philippines during Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year is the time that pretty much everybody in China goes traveling. It's about a 2-week long holiday, and it's known as the largest human migration in the world because you have people from all over China going either to their hometowns or traveling abroad or traveling to other parts of China. So it's really a big mess to try to get any kind of travel done. Getting on an airplane, getting train tickets, any of that stuff sells out way early. And of course you have all sorts of situations where there are really packed airports, train stations, etc. That is probably how the virus spread so much and also was able to spread all over the world. If it hadn't happened during Chinese New Year, it probably wouldn't have been nearly as bad. So it's really horrible timing. Anyways, my girlfriend and I were in the Philippines for pretty much the worst of it as far as the lockdown goes in China. The first day we went, my girlfriend was already following along with the news, saying, oh, there's this new virus in Wuhan and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, well, whatever. It's probably nothing. You know, there's been all these viruses over the years, in my lifetime at least, that have never really amounted to anything such as the scale that COVID has been. And I just thought, you know, whatever, it's probably just some part of town that's not very clean, or I don't know, my arrogant ass thinking that it would never happen in the US, so why should I care? Of course, as the days went on, things got worse, and my girlfriend kept telling me about how there's more cases, and by the end of our trip, they had already been cases that were coming into even the Philippines and other parts of Europe and maybe even the US at that point. My school was supposed to start back on November 1st, so we were all set to fly back, But then my school said, hey, we're going to stay closed for another 2 weeks. We're not opening until February 17th. So we thought, okay, great. We can actually avoid going back and not have to be stuck inside all day and enjoy the beautiful beaches of the Philippines. Of course, that sounds better. So we ended up staying in the Philippines for about another week. We actually got to see my friend's wedding, who got married there, because we weren't going to make it. And then we tried to fly back the next day, and then our flight was canceled. So then they started canceling flights between the Philippines and Guangzhou. Then ended up spending 3 days in Japan trying to get back because we had to fly to Japan to get back to Guangzhou. We even tried flying one time through Korea, but they wouldn't even let my girlfriend on the plane because South Korea was like, no Chinese can even get on the plane if you don't have a visa, which she did not. But she did have a visa to Japan. So we were able to fly to Japan for 3 days. That was awesome. We got to see some cool sights. Osaka Castle, went to Universal Studios, Harry Potter World, all that crap. It was really awesome. Then we flew back on February 14th, back into Guangzhou. At this point, you know, it was still pretty much lockdown ghost town there.
Stay home, no party, put on mask.
It's pretty crazy because Guangzhou is such a huge populous city, but, you know, there's like, go outside and there's like nobody on the streets. Maybe a few people walking around here and there. However, by that point, it had already kind of gotten past the worst of it. We kind of were gone for most of the bad parts of the lockdown, where it was like literally nobody on the streets. But by that point, they'd already kind of started restarting certain aspects of the business. So, such as public transportation, bus drivers, taxi drivers, and people who work for public services, like these guys who are out there taking out the trash, sweeping leaves and stuff like that, and spraying down the sidewalks. They do that every day. So those guys were out there again, but most people were not. And then my school was set to start on the 17th, but we were not going back, obviously. So they said, okay, we're going to do online classes. So we started doing online classes. About a week after we got back, things had already kind of started to slowly reopen in Guangzhou. There were some restaurants that had been doing only delivery, kind of like they did here. But then they started opening them up with limited seating, spread out and all that, social distancing, whatnot. Another thing they did, when you go into the place, you have to sign in and for basically like contact tracing. I'll talk about that more as well. But what eventually happened was some people, I went out to some restaurants like once a week because I wanted to at least just get out of the house once a week and go outside. And just to have some lunch and watch, they were showing some UFC fights or something like that. So I was watching the UFC fight, and it was at lunchtime because it was nighttime somewhere else in the world. And yeah, it was really cool. But then it turned out some foreigner had gotten the virus, and he was in the same restaurant that I was about a week after me. So his information was written down on this tracing chart or whatever, and so was mine. So I was like, all right, I'm done. I'm not going out anymore. So I basically bunkered down for the rest of the time. And occasionally went out again. But mainly I did not want to get quarantined. So if you were caught or found to have the virus, you'd be put into a quarantine hotel. And you had to pay about $80 a night, and you had to stay there for 2 weeks. And also people who were coming back into the country in late February and early March also had to do this. They had to quarantine for 2 weeks before they were let back into the country. And I have a couple friends that went through this, and they have different experiences. I'll talk about that later as well. But basically, after that guy had caught it in the restaurant that I was, and there was a couple other cases going around, people started to say, hey, the foreigners are the ones spreading this. And that quickly caught on. And that led to some of the bad things that happened. But in the end, after a while, there were some scary times, but in the end, things did reopen, and schools and all that opened back up in June. And that was about 4 months of doing online classes and basically staying inside as much as possible. But before that, other Chinese companies had already reopened and other things like that. So they were pretty much back to normal. It was really just teachers, students, and children that was kind of stuck inside for that long. So things did reopen, things got a lot better, and things have just kind of been getting better and better since as far as COVID is related. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a big part in the middle there that was pretty rough. So that's basically an overview of what happened. Now I'll get into some of the specifics about the good, the bad, and the ugly, as I call it. So let's talk about some of the good things and how China was able to crush the virus pretty much and stop it in its tracks. So one of the things was that there was uniform cooperation from the people, mostly. Reasons for this: one, people in China take being sick much more seriously than they do here. There's so many superstitions about ways you can get sick and so many cautionary things about how not to get sick. Most of Chinese medicine is all about preventative medicine. So drink hot water every day and it'll keep you from getting sick. Don't drink, certain things and there's all these rules about what will make you sick or not. I'll do a whole nother video about that probably. But either way, when the virus happened, everybody immediately took it seriously. Nobody was like, oh, this isn't real. Everyone was like, yeah, this is something we've seen before. 2003, SARS, remember that? Yeah, so people knew how to react, and nobody, thought it was anything other than what it was. On top of that, you had, unambiguous messaging from the scientists in China telling people, okay, wear masks, do this, do that, do that. And that's not to say that there weren't some other people saying masks maybe aren't good. And there certainly was a problem in that masks sold out really fast and some people couldn't get them and some doctors and hospitals couldn't get them. So I think when I go back to the US, I know that was something that people said in the beginning, like, don't buy masks because they need them for the professionals need them. Hospitals need those more than the average people. You can just stay in your house. So we didn't really have a mask shortage. For some reason, everyone thought toilet paper was going to run out, so everyone bought that, which is weird to me, but whatever. And then another thing is, I'll talk about masks specifically. So the mask culture in China has been a thing. It's been something that people do when you're sick. Say, if you just have a cough, and you got to go to work still, but it's not serious enough of a cough to stay home with a fever, but you don't want to be coughing all over your workmates and whatnot. And offices there are a lot more condensed. Like, your desk is not like a huge cubicle. You're usually sitting. A lot of these offices are like little desks where you just have a computer and there's someone right next to you on either side. So it makes sense. You don't want to be spreading your germs all over the place. And since, like I said, SARS happened in 2003, I think masks at that point became more commonplace for people to wear after being sick. That might be the case here in the US now that we've had to experience that, but who knows? And not only that, but masks have been a thing way before that, since, early 1900s in Asia and Japan and whatnot, not just China. But it became more of a thing recently. And even further than that, masks are also just something that people wear for fun. Like, people have those kind of nice designer masks that have cool pictures on them, and people wear those to go out sometimes, especially in places where it's cold. Like, I was with my friend in Busan, South Korea, and he was wearing one. So when we were going out to a bar or a club, and I was like, why are you wearing that? And he's like, oh, it's just a style thing. So it's also part of the style for some people. So, when everyone's like, you need to wear masks, nobody was like, oh no, this is taking away my freedom. That's just not part of the culture there. Everybody's already used to it, and it's so normalized that, and like I said, it's not even always about being sick. Sometimes it's just for style. So everybody was like, yeah, cool. Of course we're going to wear masks.
Another thing China was able to do very well was having a test available for the virus quite early on. Even by the time we'd gotten back from our trip, which was only about 3 weeks after we started hearing about it, they already had testing available for people who were thinking that they might have it, and it was pretty easy to go to a hospital and get tested. Obviously, having that ability gives you more information as to where the virus is more concentrated and where you need to lock down more. Obviously, not having that information and not having tests available in the US definitely seemed to let the virus spread out of control more so in the early stages before we knew who had it and how many people could have it.
Another good thing that people did there was that at least the government had all this kind of infrastructure in place that was able to get this under control very quickly. Every single apartment building always already has a baoan, which is a security guard, sitting outside. And so those guys suddenly got the job to, okay, now we have to scan your, what do you call it, temperature with one of those little laser thermometers, either on your wrist or sometimes on your forehead whenever you go into somewhere. So if you have a fever, obviously you're not going in. And I don't know what they would do. I've never seen someone be denied, but I assume they would either send you home, or maybe they would even go so far as to like have someone go test you and then maybe put you in quarantine. But yeah, they had really good stuff like that and good tracing things. So one of the things that they have in WeChat is called the Suikong code. And it's part of your, so you have your WeChat app, and then if you scroll up, you get these little things at the top. And then this one here looks like a little stethoscope. Opens up, and there it is. So it's this app, or it's part of your WeChat app, and basically it's contact tracing, you know? I mean, the thing is, another thing though, in China, nobody cares about public privacy because everybody knows that there's cameras everywhere and that the government can look at whatever they want. And, you know, people need to know that that's pretty much how it is here, at least in the digital world. We don't have cameras like they do there for sure. But as far as that goes, you know, they can trace you with this. They can see like, okay, has he been to an area where there was an outbreak? And then like sometimes you hit that code and then it'll log in with your phone number and they can see if it, I don't know, it'll pop up some alert if you're a possible risk or something like that. So that's another thing that they have. And on top of that, they have these things where every time you go into a restaurant or a business where there's a lot of people, they have a little chart, like a clipboard, and then you sign in your name, you write down your temperature, you write down your phone number, and then if somebody is found to have the virus that's been to the same place as you, they can look at that chart and say, okay, look at all the people that were there on the same day or around the same time, and they can contact all those people and get them tested or whatnot, or put them in quarantine or whatever.
So another thing is that in China, people tend to trust their doctors and scientists a lot more, at least than they do in the US. And the big reason of that is because of this guy, Dr. Zhong Nanshan. He is the head of the coronavirus team or handling team in China, and he was also the head of it back in 2003 with SARS. So he already had a lot of adoration, respect, and trust from the Chinese people from how well they handled that outbreak back then. And also he had international respect by a lot of other countries from having that not spread too much. Plus, he's got respect from the gym bros because look at this dude. He's like 86 years old and he's still ripped as a mother. But anyways, and in the US, we have a lot of problems with Dr. Fauci as far as national trust goes. There's been a lot of political things and reasons why people decide they don't trust him for one reason or another. But just the fact that people in China really are all trusting and listening to the guy who's in charge of it there has definitely seemed to been a positive thing and helped things get under control much faster.
So anyways, with all that, they were able to basically reopen things by middle of March. When something was a problem, say a restaurant or something had an outbreak with the staff or a customer there, they would shut that down for about a week, but they didn't have to shut down everything, you know? So it was kind of like, imagine like spot cleaning when you're sweeping up different parts of the floor. You're not doing the whole floor, but you're just, okay, I'm looking for, okay, there's some dust there, I'm gonna sweep that up. So that had allowed them to really get a handle on the virus and clamp down on it and get it pretty much gone by like April-ish or end of March. And schools did not open until June. And by June, there had been like hardly any or no cases that we'd heard of, at least, whether you can trust that or not. But, you know, they hadn't had any cases for months. And so by the time they did reopen schools, everybody totally felt safe going back into it. But even still, you know, they still have practices of wearing masks. You know, everyone's still has a mask on them, at least if they're not wearing it outside, even to this day, just in case you have to go somewhere where it's crowded or whatnot. And so even now, with hardly any cases, people are still taking it more seriously than it seems like they are here in some ways. Maybe not in every way.
So one of the last things I want to talk about is just some of the differences between the culture and the mindset between the East and the West. Now, in the West, we value individuality very highly, and personal freedoms and things like this is something that we grow up with and we feel is one of the most important things ever. And a lot of Americans I know would rather die than be told what to do or forced to do something that, went against their freedom of choice. Whereas in a lot of Eastern cultures, the idea is a lot more about the group prospering and, individuals helping the group to prosper and thus benefiting from that along with everybody else. So I think that mindset in some ways kind of helped in this particular situation, in that you didn't have a lot of people out there that were getting really fired up about being told what to do. Most people realized the necessity for what had to be done and saw it in that light, and from that perspective they didn't feel like it was as much of an oppression thing as more as just everybody kind of using the information that we had there to work together and try to get this thing taken care of as soon as possible.
So now let's talk about some of the bad things. Now I talk about this like, oh, China has this all under control and perfect. They have it well under control, but it didn't come without some problems here and there, certainly. Nowhere's perfect. And especially when you're dealing with huge populations and huge economies and all that stuff, problems get a lot harder. When you look at China, they have done a good job getting the virus under control, but they definitely went about it in a very, what you would expect the Chinese government to do. Very heavy-handed, very kind of broad sweeping things that affected more than they need to and probably hurt some people in certain ways. Certainly did. But the net result was that they got the virus under control, so that's kind of how they look at it, I guess. And I think a lot of people do agree there, honestly. It is, we can all say, we went through hell, but at least we're through it, and now we can get back to our basic normal lives there. Whereas here, it's been less like a slow, drawn-out thing where everybody's like, oh, we just want this to be over, but it's not over because we're... Anyways, whatever. But let's talk about the bad things. So, one of the bad things was, like I said, very heavy-handed. They have quarantine hotels there. So if you were found to have the virus, you could be taken forcefully or whatever. You normally would go willingly because you're not going to fight the Chinese government as a normal one-man citizen. So you go, and you go to these hotels, and for the most part, I heard the hotels were, well, I heard mixed reviews about them, but yeah, you would go to the hotel, you stay for 2 weeks, and then foreigners would have to pay $80 a night for 2 weeks. So over $1,000 after 2 weeks. And I definitely wanted to avoid that at all costs. That was effective, but it was heavy-handed. Now, where it got bad was when they started doing quarantines for people who didn't even have the virus, even after they had been tested negative. So I got to go back a little bit to get into this part. When the virus had all started, everything was like, okay, guys, we're all in this together, fight the virus. Everyone's like on the same team, and we're all working together. Great. But after a while, there was some outbreak that happened in this part of town called Xiaobei, which is the African neighborhood, basically. And that neighborhood is actually the biggest African population in all of China. At least Guangzhou has the largest population of African people in China. And that's because China does a lot of trading and business with different African countries, and it's just a big business international port anyway. So there happened to be some guy there that caught the virus. He was either an African guy or maybe it was a Chinese guy who had a restaurant in the neighborhood. I don't know. I've heard different reports. But anyways, there was a small outbreak in that area. But the government went in with overwhelming force and basically just like started testing everybody there. And it definitely was like more than what they needed to do, and it was very overboard.
City leaders in southern China are denying allegations of coronavirus racism, insisting that foreigners are not being discriminated against. Africans living in Guangzhou say that they're being kicked out of their homes and face harassment as health workers step up testing for imported infections. The African Union, Nigeria and Ghana are calling on the Chinese government to address concerns.
But then that led to a lot of, like I said, racism online, social media. People were starting to say like, oh, African people are spreading the virus, blah, blah, blah. And that led to a lot of bad things socially. My friends who are there, who are even of like, darker skin and are not even, whether they're actually black or whether they're, Middle Eastern or, whatever, were treated like they were, like somehow more susceptible to have the virus. And basically any foreigner, even me a little bit, but I definitely will admit I got it much lighter. Foreigners in general were definitely getting discriminated against because of this, because it was suddenly foreigners are the ones that have the virus and they're the ones that are spreading it now. We've got it under control, but now the resurgence happened and foreigners are spreading it.
Ever since Xi Jinping announced that the virus was essentially contained in China and that they could start reopening businesses and reopening factories, the numbers have been going up, but they've been blaming all of those new numbers, those new cases and the new deaths in China on what they call imported cases, meaning that they've contained it in China, but people coming back into the country are bringing it along. It smacks a bit of xenophobia to me. Because number one, most of these so-called imported cases are Chinese nationals who left at Chinese New Year and are just now returning or returning from schools abroad, etc. So these aren't foreigners, these are Chinese who are bringing in with the virus. And secondly, they've been given really no statistics to prove that the real numbers of people coming in with the virus are actually foreigners at all. But that's kind of the narrative or the storyline that they'd like to say, is that all of these new cases are all from foreigners. They've even restricted foreign diplomats from coming back into Beijing, for example.
But African people particularly got the worst of it. And there was a lot of people that got put into quarantine hotels, and some landlords were evicting African people from the apartments they had, because there's not really a law there, like where you have a lease, you have to finish your lease, or you have to let the person finish their lease. You can just evict people willy-nilly there. So that was really hard for a lot of people. But I will say, on the opposite side, there was a lot of really good people that helped, and not only Westerners, but Chinese people as well. I was friends with some people who were organizing these groups of like helping people go and bring, whatever things that the people who got quarantined needed. Maybe they had something in their house that they needed to get, or maybe they just wanted some food that wasn't, like the whatever Chinese food that they were giving them. So people were doing all sorts of things to help, like donating, snacks and food, and volunteering to go, maybe feed someone's pet while they were in the quarantine hotel. So all that stuff. So it was really cool to see that people from both, Western and Chinese people were coming together to help the people who had been affected by this. Because it wasn't just like, oh, all Chinese people are racist. Of course, you just have a small group of bad people who talk crap on the internet.
And aside from the racial thing, it's also just a fear of the virus itself. Because when this all started in Wuhan, people who are from the province that Wuhan is in, called Hubei, were getting the same kind of treatment. If you were a Chinese person that was from Hubei province, but you were living in another city at the time, You would not be able to travel, you wouldn't be able to get a plane ticket or train ticket, and you wouldn't even be able to stay in hotels. And a lot of people ended up stuck out on the streets because of this. And eventually they did provide hotels, but basically they were put into quarantine. So as you can see, it's more of an overreaction to the fear of the virus than a racially motivated thing.
In this town on the border with Hubei, we met this distraught man. Originally from Hubei, this 49-year-old migrant worker lives in Beijing. He'd planned to return to his hometown to see his family for the holidays, but the entire region was put on lockdown. He can't go there and is now stuck here, 200 kilometers from home.
My situation is very complicated. I'm completely stuck. I have no solution in sight, and I don't know what else to do. I can't go back to Beijing, and I can't go to my hometown in Hubei province either.
He doesn't even have a place to sleep. On his ID card, the 2 characters for Hubei are clearly visible.
People in hotels look at my ID card to see where I'm from, and they systematically refuse to let me in. And all this because of that virus. Without that, I'd be home by now.
Anyways, then this all kind of came to a head when businesses started reopening. They started letting people in, but there were certain businesses such as gyms and lots of Chinese restaurants that weren't letting any foreigners in. So it doesn't matter if you're white, black, whatever. If you're not Chinese, you can't go because foreigners are spreading the virus. And it didn't really bother me because I wasn't going out much at all, but a lot of my friends who had gym memberships, you know, they couldn't go to their gyms even though the Chinese people were allowed to go. And you know, it definitely was very discriminatory. And then on top of that, this all got worse when, this was the worst thing, is when a McDonald's put a sign up in Guangzhou that basically said no black people allowed. And it said something like, for the, you know, sake of health or whatever. And so that got taken a picture of and posted online, and that got international attention. So in some ways it was good because it brought international attention to what was happening. Because, you know, in China you can't protest and you can't like bring much attention to these kind of things, not in the conventional ways. But that post went viral, and then everyone was like, what the hell's going on? And, you know, the news got involved. And so the company or the owner of that McDonald's or whoever, they had to shut down, and they also apologized, and then they had a whole retraining thing for their staff about diversity and whatnot as well. After that, there was a law made that they can no longer restrict foreigners from businesses based on not being Chinese. So that was a good thing to see, that, you know, China, you know, they actually fixed it. And after that, people were allowed to go back to those businesses again. Gyms and all that could not bar you, even though some individual owners, I heard stories where people tried to like still say no, but you could be like, listen, show me in the law where it says I can't come in, and then they would have to let you in. That was a good thing. But yeah, it did get pretty hairy there for a while. Now the other thing I'll say is the apartments. Those were also very heavy-handed in the way that they were handled. So my apartment building, like I said, you can only go in through one entrance, and you can only go in if you live there. Now, my girlfriend and I had one little key fob, which is what you use to scan to get into the building. And between us, we only had one, and it never really mattered because the security guard would just let the other one in if we didn't have it. So after the virus and everything started, the government was like, you have to use your key fob to get in, and only one person can have one. So you can't, like, bring guests in with it. And so one time I went out to let her in, and then they were like, oh, you can't do that. And then we're like, you know, we live here. Like, the security guards know our faces. We've seen them for, you know, half of a year. And they're like, sorry. And so we had to like argue with them, and then get our landlord to call and vouch for us and say like, yes, they live there. And then we had to get a second key made the next day. And from then on, yeah, we couldn't have like anybody over. But if we did have people over, we had to do it really sneakily. What we used to do is I used to go down with both the key fobs. If I wanted to bring one friend, I wasn't having parties or anything. But then I'd go out, give my key to another friend, and then we'd go in like separately, all sneakily, just to get into my own apartment. And, you know, so that's how strict they were about, like, not letting you have guests over or anything. Everybody had to stay in their own place. Like, obviously, if you're in the building, you can go to other people's houses within the same building, but you couldn't, like, be bringing guests in at all. And even that didn't work after a while, because they made a new thing where, again, they were targeting foreigners. They had us all have to sign in on a paper. And basically, they had a paper, kind of like I told you when you go into a restaurant or something. But, you know, you had your information, like your name, your passport number, your apartment number, your phone number, and all this information on a sheet of paper. And every time I would come into my apartment, I had to go to this guy at this table outside my gate and tell him my name, and he would find my page, and then he would take my temperature and write it down and write the time I came in. So that was to, like, see, okay, how many times is this guy going out? What's his temperature, obviously? And if you're not living there and you don't have your sheet there, then they're not going to let you in. So then I couldn't I couldn't bring anybody in. And that was super crappy, because it was only the foreigners that had to do it. If it had been everyone, I would have been like, okay, that's just strict, but it's fair. But the fact that the Chinese people did not have to do that, only the foreigners had to have this paper where we had to go and sign in. We couldn't just walk in with our key anymore. So yeah, that was pretty annoying. And another thing is that eventually, because there was taking forever to find people's names, you know, because they're finding an English name, if you're a Chinese person who doesn't speak English, is going to be a lot harder. They eventually just numbered them. So my number was 11. So it was like, oh, this is like my prisoner number.
Who am I?
Or something like that. But anyways, I thought it was kind of funny because my name rhymes with 11, Evan 11. So I even have a little ring with that printed on it as well. But anyways, so that's pretty much the bad stuff as far as it being overly heavy-handed and xenophobic and a bit racist as well. You know, in China, you have to remember that it's like 99.9% of the people there are Chinese. So the foreigner community there is a lot smaller and easier to monitor, whereas in America it's much more diverse. So, like, you have to understand that it's not so much of a hateful thing as much as it's more of a just kind of an ignorance thing and people not understanding much about the outside world. But again, that's only some people, and there's also lots of really great Chinese people who don't feel that way at all. Now, to be fair, on the flip side, we should definitely discuss what's been in the news a lot lately, which is anti-Asian hate crimes that have been happening in the US as a result of the pandemic as well, and possibly because of political rhetoric or whatever. But I'll leave that up to you to decide what you think it's from. But the fact of the matter is, there's all these videos coming out about people harassing Asian people.
What are you doing in this country?
What am I doing in this country?
Oh, you look at this
What am I doing in this country?
Yeah.
What am I doing in this country?
We
I'm
have
an
enough
American
people.
citizen.
So it's really sad, and when I see these videos, it just makes me feel really sick to my stomach that I share a country with people that are like this. But, you know, they exist, and, you know, if anything, it's at least good that we know that they're there so we can deal with it. And we all need to come together. Anybody who thinks that this stuff is horrible needs to stand up and speak out against it. And I hope the same is also true for any people who are Chinese living in China who see videos of Africans being treated like this, or even other Chinese people, you know, being treated like they're lesser than human or something because of fear of the virus. You know, it's really not okay. You know, we need to all treat each other as humans, as earthlings that we all are. We're all people that live on Earth together, and we need to learn how to share it. And I think the world needs to come together and fight against this kind of discrimination and hate, hopefully. So, I hope you agree. So this part, I'm going to talk about the quarantine hotels. Now, I don't necessarily think that they are a good or a bad thing entirely. There is positives and negatives. This has been one of the big ways that China has been able to keep the virus under control. So in the sense that it's saving people from getting the virus and possibly saving lives, and that way it is a good thing. So as far as these hotel experiences went, there were definitely mixed reviews. Some people had really good experiences, some people had bad experiences. From what I was hearing, most foreigners would have to pay around $80 a night. Like I said before, Chinese people usually got a little bit of a cheaper rate because they probably got put into maybe a cheaper hotel, and that's maybe because the Chinese average citizen doesn't make as much as most foreigners who live there, who are living on higher salaries because of whatever their job might be. So, as far as the hotel experiences go, I'll talk about a couple different ones. First of all, when you were returning to China, if you're a foreigner or anyone returning to China between like late February and middle of March, they were still letting people come in, but then you would have to go into a quarantine hotel and stay there for 2 weeks before they would let you into the country. So a couple of my friends were coming back from abroad. They were both foreigners. One of them had a really nice hotel with a suite and, you know, a big room and everything, and he had a fine time there. He said it was not too bad. The other friend got put in a really not so great room, and she was, I don't know how big the room was, but she said there was lots of issues with the room. I don't remember it specifically, but one of the things was that it didn't have any Wi-Fi, and there was no TV. The TV didn't work as well. So she had to do all of her work and everything from her hotspot on her phone with her computer. And I guess on top of that, the people who were in charge of her lost her paperwork. So they kind of forgot that she was in there, and she wasn't getting any contact. And she had to call her consulate, which eventually, after repeated calls through her consulate, they eventually figured out, you know, who was in charge of her, and then got her out of there. So she didn't have to continue the whole quarantine in that room. She was able to do the rest of it, second week of it, in her home, because she lived in Guangzhou anyway. Now, for other people who were in China the whole time, you might have to get quarantined if you were around someone who was found to have the virus, or if you were suspected of having it yourself for some reason or another. So two of my friends actually lived in my apartment building. Not my exact apartment room, but in the building, like one building over or something. They both had to go into quarantine because one of them was friends with a guy who tested positive. So they told their landlord, you know, just being responsible, and then the landlord alerted the government or whoever, and then they got both put into quarantine. One of them did test positive, and he had to spend another couple weeks in a hospital, even though he never showed any symptoms. And the other one tested negative, and he was allowed to finish his quarantine in the room. And he said his room was fine. It was just like a normal, average hotel room. And at the end of the time, he said he didn't even have to pay, which was pretty interesting, because most of the people I heard had to pay, like I said, around $80 per night. So that was a fine experience for him. He was able to get out. And the other thing, the last one, which was the most scary, was one of my friends who I work with. Our school is near the Xiaobei neighborhood, which was one of the big places that was seen as a hotspot or whatever. And so lots of people from there were getting tested, and this was like at the beginning, kind of the first or the second wave, basically. So things had calmed down. Then they started targeting foreigners because of this community, and this African community had an outbreak. So suddenly, and of course abroad in the US and other places, the virus was getting worse. So people were saying like, oh, people are bringing it back from abroad, even though a lot of people who were bringing it back were actually Chinese people coming back home, because they stopped letting foreigners back in March. So anybody who was coming back after that date they were still letting Chinese nationals return. So anyways, whatever. So my friend, who happens to be South African, was quarantined in her house, even though she tested negative twice. The government or police or whoever came to her house tested her twice. She tested negative both times, and then even still, she thought she was okay. They came back the third day and they said, hey, sorry, we have to quarantine you. And she said, why? I've tested negative. And they said, well, we don't know. This is just what they're telling us to do. And I guess they were pretty nice to her, but at the same time, you know, it was like, you know, this kind of like, ugh, you're being nice, but you're still putting me in you're still locking me up in my home for no reason. So that was really scary for, I think, everyone else, because we all thought like, all right, well, she didn't even test positive. What's to stop them from just using that same excuse and putting all of us in quarantine or whatever? And, you know, with the Chinese government, you never know what could happen, especially as a foreigner. You don't really have much rights as a foreigner. So certainly it was scary for me, at least, my mind started going to the worst possible scenario. Okay, my gosh, what's going to happen? So she was in her house for 1 week, and they basically put a seal on her door or something. They might have had a camera outside where they would make sure she couldn't, open the door. They would bring her food, and they would bring her whatever she needed, and they would test her, I think, every day. And after a week of testing negative, they eventually decided to say, okay, you don't have to do the full 2 weeks. And, she just hangs out with our school and our workmates, and, she's not hanging out in even that area. But just the fact that she had a African country's passport, I think, is what put her on the list or whatever to go get checked. So that was pretty scary, but in the end, everybody who went into quarantine that I knew got out, and all the fears that I had about, oh my gosh, they're going to use this as an excuse to do XYZ, didn't happen. So in the end, it was good. And, they still do that. Now they've started letting people come back. So if you do have to go back to China, you do have to go into one of those quarantine hotels. But again, just the early fear when we didn't really know what was going on definitely made it worse than it really was. So that's not really a good or bad thing. It's just their policy, and that's how it works. Okay, so last I want to talk about 2 more things that were pretty crazy. So for one, as I mentioned before, this guy who is a doctor in Wuhan tried to warn the world and other medical professionals that this was coming. On December 30th, he posted a video about it on Weibo. This was December 30th, 2019. Weibo is kind of like Chinese Facebook, or it's a social media website that a lot of people use. And you probably have heard of him. He was basically shut down by the government, told to stop spreading lies. He had to sign a paper that said, he was spreading misinformation and adding to the disorder of the public or something like that. And, it's possible that it was one of those things like Donald Trump did where he thought he didn't want to scare people, or, so he says. But, to not cause a panic, basically, where it wasn't necessary. But surely looking back in hindsight, we can all see that clearly this guy was right, and he got silenced by the government. And the other thing is that he shortly thereafter died of COVID. He's only 34 years old, didn't seem like that sick of, unhealthy of a guy, but then again, he was a doctor working in the ground zero of the virus, so maybe he did die of COVID. Who knows? But either way, that's an unfortunate thing, very unfortunate, because if he hadn't been silenced, or, if people had taken him seriously, if his message was allowed to spread, it's possible that this would never have even gotten out of Wuhan. Now, on the flip side, there was a lot of, Chinese people who, saw this guy as a hero. So I guess if some good could come of it, at least it shows that, we shouldn't silence our professionals, and we shouldn't silence people who are trying to spread the truth. And I think a lot of Chinese people saw that and, realized the dangers of oppressing freedom of speech and that kind of thing. The other side of it is, the other thing that I wanted to say, no, he's sleeping, I think, so he's not going to hear. But there was some people who were doing bad things to pets as well. And this stemmed from a rumor that started where someone said that animals could carry the virus or bring it into your home. Like, you could be taking your dog out for a walk, he could be, I don't know, step in some virus or something like that, or sniff something, and then come back and then spread it to your family. So this rumor got around, and a lot of people started freaking out, and a lot of people ended up abandoning their pets and animals. And there's an article I'll post down below that is talking about people who saw, in Shanghai at least, there was like lots of stray dogs walking around, but these weren't like strays, they were like designer dogs, like nice, expensive dogs that were just kind of let go and kind of set free, which is pretty sad because obviously this was just a rumor, and it ended up turning out that this wasn't true, and a lot of people, maybe acted rashly. But then again, when it comes to, like, if it's you or family versus your dog, you're probably going to choose your family. At that time, nobody knew how serious the virus was either. So We didn't know if it was going to kill everyone or if it only kills certain people, or, we at least know now who are more susceptible to it. In my neighborhood, they did make a restriction in our apartment that you could not take your dog for a walk during the day anymore. You could only take your dog for a walk between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. And that was probably because they had a bunch of old people who were scared of dogs or cats or whatever spreading the virus. So anyways, again, it's just unfortunate misinformation that gets spread, and then people jump onto it, and some people take it way too seriously and do things that they probably end up regretting later. But yeah, those were the two things that I thought were kind of like, I don't know, weren't really policies or I don't know, they were just horrible things that happened. And it might sound like I'm being overly negative, but what can you expect? It's a pandemic, there's not a whole lot of great things to talk about and happy things. But now I'll talk about the aftermath. So, like I said, schools reopened the beginning of June in Guangzhou. And I know other cities around China were kind of reopening around the same time. Wuhan had one of the most strict clampdowns or, restrictions and testing and all that stuff, as you might imagine. And they're actually one of the most open places now because they had such a hard lockdown that they were able to basically get rid of it. And now it's certain other parts of the country have had small little outbreaks. Like there was one in Beijing, and there was a big, scare there, and they were saying it was from imported salmon, from what I heard. It was from what my girlfriend told me from the news that she read. Another place that had an outbreak was Qingdao, which you might know from the famous Chinese beer Qingtao, which is spelled a little differently. On the beer, it's spelled with a Tsingtao. The actual city name is spelled Qingdao, but it's the same thing, and it's the city that makes that beer. It's also up in the north near Beijing, and they only had about 12 cases. 6 of them were asymptomatic, but they immediately jumped on it, and they did like a citywide testing. Within 5 days, they tested like 5 million people. There's a link in the description as well. Like I said, whenever there is a small outbreak or whatever in China, they jump on it hard, and they make sure that it is not going to get out of hand again because, like I said, they know how bad it could be, especially in a place like China where you have so many people living so close together. In Guangzhou, there hasn't been any resurgent cases yet. Hopefully there won't be. And, it's been more and more open as time has gone on. And like I said, even before the schools opened, things were pretty much open to go out. I just didn't go out because I didn't want to, basically because I'm a foreigner. And when I was going out, people would still give me these looks like, oh, where are you from? Oh, are you coming back from America? Because they don't realize that the borders have been closed to Westerners. And, they give me looks like, like I'll be walking by, I have my mask on, they won't, they'll have their mask down, and then I'll be talking to their friends, and then they see me, and they're like, oh, and pull their mask up like that. And it's like, come on, dude, I've been here just as long as you guys have. But again, it's that whole fear of foreigners kind of thing, and it I don't know, whatever. We're trying to say oh, this isn't our thing, this is their thing. And to be fair, it is now. It's more of our problem than it is the Chinese problem. But we can't forget that, that's where it started, and that's where I was when it started, so why are you treating me different than any other person? But anyways, after that now, things have been opening more and more, and another big difference that I've noticed since they reopened schools is that schools are hurting for teachers now because, like I just mentioned, they had closed the borders to Westerners re-entering the country in March, and Chinese people were still allowed to come back, but Westerners not. So all these schools that rely on having foreign teachers as their business model and as their selling point suddenly are short on all these teachers. So a lot of schools closed down, and the ones that are still open are also paying more because they really need teachers, and there's just not enough teachers to go around. They have started recently reopening the borders for people who have work visas. So say if you had a work visa before the pandemic started or during it, and it expired during the pandemic, they would extend it so that you could come back and renew it. So that's kind of cool. So a lot of my friends who were outside the country are now able to come back, but it's not that easy because the flights are very expensive to go back, and then you also have to do 2 weeks quarantining in a hotel and pay another $1,000 for that just to get back into the country. So you really have to have, enough money invested in China to be willing to spend several $1,000s to get back there, So some of my friends who own businesses there did that. Other friends who were just teachers, maybe they're not going to. I'm not sure. But another thing is, they still do have the contact tracing. They have the Suicon code thing. That's still a big part of it. And there's still more restrictions for foreigners than there are for Chinese, even though foreigners are allowed to go places. When I go, say, to some places like there's this snowboarding place that I'll be making a video about shortly, or maybe I've already made it at this point, depending on when you're watching. That video, or that place, they have you go in and then you show them your little code, but then you also have to scan a QR code, type in a phone number, or type in your phone number, then they send you a confirmation code to make sure it's your phone number, then you fill out all this crap, and it's like this whole process, and my Chinese girlfriend and her friend didn't have to do any of that. So it's like, it's just frustrating that they still act like we're different, or, again, if it's in this concern of public safety, it really was just like a 5-minute extra process for me to do all that, so it's not a huge deal, and if it's helping in some way, I'm okay with it, but it is a little frustrating being treated differently. And I'm sure people who are Asian or Chinese people living in America during all this have probably had their fair share of discrimination and things like that happen to them as well. So that's just how the world works sometimes. So another thing they started doing recently that you might have heard on the news is they're doing anal swab tests. So there's a funny little clip that you can see here. They're using a mannequin, and the guy is showing how to stick a Q-tip in the mannequin's bum. So that's pretty silly, but I hear in a lot of some hospitals, more traditional Chinese hospitals, they still take the temperature that way up the butt as well. So I don't know. Another interesting thing is that you probably heard some stuff about the conspiracies about the virus being started in a lab, or created and blah 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 by China to attack the US and yada yada yada. Well, of course, China has its own conspiracy theories, and they have a lot of ones that think that we were the ones who started it. They've actually blamed several countries, not just America. But one of the things I heard at the beginning, anyway, when my girlfriend and I were talking about this, she was telling me some article she read that there was a conspiracy theory that U.S. soldiers had brought the virus to Wuhan in 2019, because apparently there was some sort of sports event, like for military people, kind of like an Olympics, from a bunch of different countries participated, but it was all military personnel that were competing in these sporting events. Now apparently all the American sportsmen and women lost all their events, which is pretty suspicious in itself, because America is usually doing really well in sports, especially in the regular Olympics. So the theory is that these guys were actually there not to compete in sports, but to go and plant the virus in Wuhan or whatever. And then the other thing that they're saying is that when the military people were leaving, the U.S. soldiers refused to have their bags checked by the Chinese security or government or whoever. And so, from those two options, they lost the sporting event, they didn't have their bags checked. So take a giant leap from there to, they must have been there to drop the virus off or something like that. So these are the kinds of things that most Chinese people don't believe, I don't think, but there actually are some high-ranking people in China that have been kind of spreading this kind of stuff around. So I think a lot of people do believe it. And I actually ran into a Chinese kid in the airport on the way back to America when I was in Seattle for a layover, and he told me his uncle is in the Chinese party, and he believes that kind of thing. Even though this kid is like, he's like saying how ridiculous that is, but his uncle believes it. So it is kind of scary that people believe this kind of stuff, and yeah, I don't know, but that's conspiracies. Everybody believes any stupid thing they want that makes them feel comfortable, whether or not there's any real truth to it or not. So. So, in conclusion, China handled the pandemic the way you might have expected. When you don't have to worry about things like citizens' rights, you can do and get away with a lot more. Unfortunately, this led to a lot of measures that were very overboard and unnecessary. But in those early days, nobody really knew how bad it was. So let's say if it had been as deadly as something like Ebola, then those measures would have seemed a lot more justified. On the other hand, most people there were actually willing to accept those strict measures because they saw it as a fair trade-off for the safety of the general people. And again, people in China just take sickness and health much more seriously. If you're an American watching this, you might be very shocked to hear some of these things. But as somebody who's lived in China for many years, it wasn't really shocking at all. You hear about this kind of stuff a lot in your daily life. But the big difference was that this was all just happening at once and everywhere in China. So on a much larger scale. I do not think they should or could have done the same things in the US. Obviously, we have very different cultures, laws, and freedoms here that prevent the government from taking such measures. And I'm very thankful for that. With a free society, we have to rely on people choosing the right things for themselves. And this is why it is imperative that these people get the best information possible. And I think this is where our government really dropped the ball the worst. The information coming from the top was constantly being second-guessed and contradicted by various political leaders and parties. Perhaps if it wasn't during an election year, we might have actually been able to come together and agree on what the best steps to take together. But instead it turned into a war of ideologies where one side was against the other, and things like wearing a mask became synonymous with party affiliation, and even believing in the virus was actually, if the virus was even actually real, is something people, hold to as a party affiliation, it seems like. Fortunately, it's still to this day, people don't even believe it sometimes. On top of that, this is the first pandemic in most people's living memory that has been something like this, and certainly to any Americans, this is the first time that anybody I know has had to live through a lockdown or anything, so we had no idea what to expect, and we're pretty underprepared. I also expected our government to at least be a little bit better prepared before it came to the US, because it had been in the news since December of 2019. I guess they were just like me in that they never expected it to actually get to the US or become as bad as it did. I just expected the world's largest intelligence organization to know more, or at least the same, as someone like me who was just a normal guy living in China at the time. As far as the racism stuff goes, sadly, there's plenty of that in China and America, but the main difference for me was that the racism or xenophobia or whatever there seemed to be kind of backed up by what the government was saying and doing, such as saying that all foreigners were the ones responsible for bringing in the virus after March. And, making us do, barring foreigners from certain restaurants or from certain businesses, and also making us do way more steps of tracing and stuff like that than other people. Now, this isn't super out of the norm anyway, because foreigners already do have to do a lot more tracking stuff when you enter the country. You always have to register with the police station whenever you re-enter China. And if you're staying at a hotel, like if you're just visiting as a tourist, they always take a scan of your passport, and then that gets filed into the database with the local police station as well, and they can look that up online. In America, the xenophobia and racism might have been fueled by some of the political rhetoric going around, but I think mostly the people who are feeling that way are already have that kind of hatred in their hearts. But, it was never actually a government policy here, obviously. For example, you never heard of Chinese people or Asian people having to sign in on a sheet to get into their apartment or do extra registering or tracking like that more than any other person would have had to do. And it was definitely scary living in China as a foreigner during this time. My worst fear was that they might use the virus as an excuse to do something worse, especially when they started clearly targeting foreigners and trying to put all the blame on us for the virus. Given the political situation between the US and China at the time, my fear was that this could be the start of some kind of war between our two countries, and that they might use the virus to round up all the Americans and put us in quarantine, but it actually would be some kind of, I don't know, internment camp or something like that. But again, thankfully, all those fears were unfounded, and it really did seem like they had taken care of the virus as their main motivation for getting everything done, for good or bad. But yeah, in the end, everybody who went into a quarantine that I knew was able to get out at the same time that they were told, if not even earlier. And after that, you know, everybody was able to go back to their work and their lives and pretty much get back to normal fairly quickly. So in the end, it all seemed like it was kind of worth it. But I'm sure that's not true for some people, sadly. So I know there are some more stories out there about what happened during the pandemic in China, but this video's already super long as it is, so I don't have time to go into all that. But I just wanted to mainly keep it focused on my experience and what I knew from what I saw firsthand and from what I talked to other people who were also there and experienced it. So that's it for me, guys. I'd definitely be interested to see what you guys think about this. Certainly we can look back and poke holes in what should have happened now looking back in hindsight, but at the time, you know, there was so much confusion and nobody really knew what it was going to be like, so you have to keep that in mind when judging the past. But anyways, I definitely would like to know what you guys think. If you live in another country other than America, I'd love to hear what the lockdown was like there, because I know from friends who live in Europe, you know, it was a little bit somewhere between the lockdowns in China and basically having hardly any lockdowns in the US, or at least businesses were locked down in the US. But as far as being forced to stay home, we hardly had any of that, at least where I was. So I would love to hear about your experience, and let me know what you think. I'm definitely expecting to get lots of opinions from all over the spectrum on this, because it's such a hotly contested topic, so I guess I'll have to be ready for that. But I am genuinely interested just to hear what your opinion is, and I just ask that you try to keep it civil, and just remember that we're all in this together, guys. So stay safe out there, keep strong, and I'll see you guys in the next video. All right, bye. All right, whew, that was a long video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're still watching at this point, you are truly a trooper for sticking through all the way to the end. So let me know what you think about this kind of longer format style video. I didn't really want to break this one up into different pieces because I feel like it needs to have the good and the bad together. I didn't want to make one video that was just all good things or just all bad things, because just that by itself, taken out of context, could give the wrong idea. So anyways, hope you enjoyed it, and let me know what you think about that longer format down in the comments section. And if you have any other video ideas that you want to throw my way, I would love to have those. I'm always looking for new ideas, and maybe I'll just use one of yours. I definitely have plenty of other content and ideas for the future videos coming out shortly. But until then, I'm so happy to be done with this one. I've been working on this since November of last year, as you probably saw by the beginning. And if you're still interested in seeing a little bit more, there's a little bonus video here at the end. It's an animation I did while I was teaching an animation class during the beginning of the lockdown. And our assignment was to talk about how we can prevent the virus from spreading and make an animation out of it. So without further ado, you can check that out. And other than that, if you want to like and subscribe, that'd be cool too. All right, see you guys later. Bye.
The coronavirus is an evil germ. But how can we fight it? Wear a mask to protect yourself and others. If we protect ourselves, we can kill the evil virus. Be sure to wash your hands with soap and water. We must beat the virus. Let's do it.